Again, my name is James, one of the pastors here, and a privilege to host this, and I have an opportunity to pick the brains of these gentlemen here. And certainly with Jim and Gordon, we had the privilege to have them help us here at Coastal Church with a lot of work that we're doing, and they're always pushing us, and certainly hosting this, we don't feel like we've arrived in any way, and just even connecting with some of you in your respective industries and certainly churches. I know that those of you that are with ministries that are here that are doing lots of things that are very effective. I've got Village Church, the team that's here, Springs Church, and Miracle Channel. We learn lots of stuff, and you guys do amazing things. I know, because we steal your ideas all the time. I just say that I steal your ideas. But the panel this afternoon, we're going to talk about reaching the next generation. How do we reach the next generation? But before we get into maybe the what and the how, maybe we start with the question why. Why is it important, whether it's a church, whether it's a ministry, or any organization that you work for, and just recognizing certainly in marketing and advertising, we're always targeting the next generation. It's not even young adults or colleges, it's hitting the tweens. It's get them as young as we can and begin to influence that. So all of you have expertise in that area, so I'll give you each a chance to jump in on maybe why is it important? Why is it important that we have influence, or why is it important that we need to learn to reach the next generation?
Yeah, well, I think we all agree that if we've got a story worth telling, we want to transmit it to other constituent groups, and they all have a sense of cultural assumptions surrounding them, especially the generational assumptions that we grow up with. So if you're born digital or you're a digital native today, you have access to ideas at a different rate and climate and style than any generation before you. So if you've grown up with things that are second nature, you know the old quip, if you need to fix your phone or something computer, get a teenager to fix it for you. Well, there's a logic to that because they've grown up with it as second nature as opposed to someone who grew up with, I was laughing when Phil showed the evolution or devolution of man and the evolution of technology. There's sort of a correlation. But I can remember those brick size, I can remember those brick-sized mobile phones and thinking, this is really cool. And you think about it now, how much things have changed. But as much as things change, they're forever the same.
Yeah.
So what are those cultural assumptions that impose themselves and prevent younger people from actually seeing what they lack in some respects is a certain kind of wisdom and a certain kind of perspective historically. So at the rate of speed people are learning things, we still have to break this down. I think Phil does a great job at least provoking me to say this is why you need to be doing things that I'm not necessarily as inspired to do or motivated to do or comfortable doing all the time, because I'm one of those people that's fractured and fragmented and distracted anyway. So I don't necessarily need to divide my life into more fractionalized means of expression. But it's critical because we're bearing a torch. We've received something and we're passing it along. And I think if you're coming at this, and I said this earlier, I'm not assuming everybody here at the conference shares what we call a biblical worldview. Even if you're on the faith journey that we're on, we haven't come fully into what all of this means, its implications and ramifications for our life. I certainly haven't. So when Paul says be transformed by the renewal of your mind, you might prove what is good, acceptable, and perfect. I'm pretty sure I'm not at the teleos stage of perfection or real maturity yet. But along the way, we're passing something out. And then I'm reminded of a famous passage in the book of books. And it's where Paul writes it in writing to Timothy, says, that which you've heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, impart to faithful ones who will be able to teach others also. 2 Timothy 2:2 is certainly a depiction of, multiplicity of platforms.
I certainly think that the story you even shared this morning, talking about the boy and the quote that was, I think you made a reference that 8-year-old, give me someone at 8, and I can shape them to be a man. And so that certainly rings true of influencing them at a young age. Anything to add to that on the why?
My philosophy is if whatever audience you want to reach, you need to immerse yourself in what they're into. Their culture, their popular music, their movies, their literature, whatever audience. I mean, I went to my high school reunion last fall, And I thought, this is the oldest bunch of people I've ever seen in my life. And these are my high school friends. And I thought, I'm never going back with these guys. They were completely out of touch. And I thought, I never want to get that way. Fortunately, God has, decided to surround me with people who think I'm idiots, and they're mostly younger people. And so I think I'm an idiot, and they're mostly younger people. And by doing that, I'm just really much more aware of what's happening and what's going on out there. And so I think a key part of reaching any audience, whatever audience you want to reach, is just immersing yourself into their world and speaking their language. The biggest beef I have with Christians today is that we speak this language that's completely different from what the world speaks. I was at a restaurant. I was shooting a music video in Nashville a few years ago, and I was shooting with this raging pagan crew. They were super guys, but they're all heathens. And I took them out to eat. They were terrific guys. And we went out to eat to this restaurant, and there was a pastor there. And this pastor had been at a conference I'd actually spoken at a year earlier. And he went running up to me and said, Phil, I just want to tell you, I made notes about what you talked about, and we launched this outreach to men in our community based on some of the things you said. And he told me all about it. And at the end of his conversation, he said, the bottom line, Phil, is we just had a mighty time of fellowship. And I looked at my crew, and they looked at me like, what? And the thought occurred to me, does anybody hang around the water cooler at the office and say, hey, Bob, on Friday night, let's go out after work to the bar and have a mighty time of fellowship? I don't think so. And we have this language of the church that we've just grown up with that nobody understands. So you got to get out of the bubble and get into the world that you're trying to reach.
And really, it's, do you have a story that you believe is going to make a difference? And if you do, then the task for you is, how do I make sure that story translates to people who aren't speaking my language? And if you're not translating the story, if you're not figuring out ways to speak it in a different way, then no one's going to get it. And so your story makes no difference at all. So it's almost like, again, if you're not doing the diligence of changing the story or making the story work for someone who's engaging with story in the abstract on a different level, then, what difference does your story make? Do something else.
Yeah, that's good. Well, let me just stick with that for a moment longer. In your world of comics, and certainly, how many of you have watched a superhero movie in the last, the hands are up there already.
Bless you, I see those hands.
If not, come tonight, right? We'll show Iron Man. But you talk about the content, the story, and comics, they're not new, and they've been around, but certainly there's been a fascination, I would say, with superhero movies and TV series. I know living in this around area downtown, there's a superhero series being shot kind of almost any given weekend. We'll see that happening. Let's say Marvel Comics and DC Comics and all that, do they have a demographic that they've always targeted? Or even, who are your audience? Who would you say are the comic audience that you write for? Do you specifically target audience to focus your story on? Speak their language?
I mean, every comic, they hope, has a certain audience, and the comics like a Justice League, like a Spider-Man, reach probably the largest audience, which is why those books, or Captain America, is always, they always reach a giant group of people. And what's interesting is it always used to be Spider-Man or the X-Men when you look at like the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, where Marvel looked at those characters and said, this is our flagship character. But now, because of the movies, Iron Man is their flagship character. It's totally changed, and now Marvel is building all of their kind of franchises.
What do you attribute that to?
I think part of it is just, part of it is, I think, the power of Robert Downey Jr. Truly, because you know what? Growing up, when I read an Iron Man comic, with the exception of a couple, it was probably my least favorite of the superheroes. It wasn't until Robert Downey Jr., who kind of had the zeitgeist of having, had a lot of mistakes in his own life, then taking on a hero who had made a lot of mistakes, ultimately being transformed into Iron Man. The idea is, even the way we think of heroes has changed over the years. Like if you look back at the early like 20s and 30s, heroes specifically were, these great beacons of behavior and moral platitudes. And then when you get to the 60s and 70s, the hero, the anti-hero stage, the dirty Harrys, it was much more, well, the hero's a little better than the bad guys, but they'll cheat in every way the bad guy cheats to stop the bad guy, and that's what's necessary. And now we're in a new age of heroes in which the hero is not afraid of failing the way the old heroes had, because now a hero has been transformed by their failures. And it makes for a hero that resonates more with people.
We look at the way James Bond is being recast.
Yeah.
That's good. We will talk about the hows and the details this morning when Phil shared about the change in technology, how technology has shaped the migration patterns of the Bedouins, and how it certainly has shaped all, even modern day culture here. But before we get to the hows, maybe let's just stick with some of the overarching concepts. Are there what philosophy, or what are the main ingredients, would you say, in terms of storytelling in reaching the next generation? What are some of the essentials that do not change over time? That some of the concepts of storytelling that can apply to the next generation in the 50s. I think people in the 50s were trying to reach the next generation. In the 60s, as we look forward, that what are some of those concepts and some of those main ingredients in storytelling that you would say those need to stay the same, even though with a change in the tools and the media? What would some of those be?
Jim and Phil can talk deeply about this, but just as a sort of broader overview of this process, look at what Jim said earlier about, and what Phil said as well about origins. We're looking for some kind of understanding of our own lives, and we're going to find some kind of seminal indications of that early in life. So when you're even looking at superheroes, sure, it's entertaining, but on another level, you have a very specific, far more sophisticated than my reading of Archie comics. Although even last night, we had a very lengthy conversation, believe it or not, about the sort of cosmology of Archie comics. And because stories begin, I know it's bizarre, but...
Were drugs involved? I don't know.
No, but the zombie apocalypse was.
Well, that's good.
But this is where we get ideas from something early on. And today more than ever, if this has been described as a fatherless generation, and there's a sense in which patriarchs and family leaders, and this doesn't mean that mothers can't provide the same kind of context, but there's a sense in which we find our place, our meaning, our purpose, our origin. This is what, for example, fathers would have said in the past. This is what our family represents. And you're representing our family name, our good name. How many people say that today? What's in a name? What does it mean? And so I think part of that process is, finding our individual social context.
I think you're right. And it's interesting that although the way characters are portrayed has changed, there are elements that never change. Conflict is one of them. It's funny that rarely a month goes by that I don't get some Christian, well-meaning Christian, sending me a reality show script. And you'd be amazed at how many pastors, oh, Phil, you can't believe what goes on in my office. So here's a reality show based on my office. And yet, there's no conflict. There's no conflict. Who's interested? Who cares? And unless you have, a friend of mine wrote a book recently called The Necessity of an Enemy. And it was a Christian book about why you need to push back against something in your life. And so I think that conflict is incredibly, as Christians, we want to try to sometimes write film scripts and stuff that really don't have any conflict in them. But unless there's a problem, unless there's something you're pushing back against, that's what fascinates people. Conflict really drives stories. Agree, disagree, think I'm an idiot?
Oh, yeah. In fact, if there is no conflict, it's not a story. If there is no enemy, and you can be your own enemy, but, if there isn't anything, just don't put it in front of me, because I won't. I would say, based on what you guys were talking about, though, that as far as the future goes and stuff like that, we need to embrace distraction. As opposed to fighting against it, we need to say, no, we live in a world in which distraction has now become the way that people live their lives. They're constantly being distracted. Their life is built upon what's the cool, weird little thing I discovered today, what's the cool little... And we need to come up with ways to embrace and take hold of distraction and build it so that every time we're sending a message out there, it's more distracting than all the other distractions.
That's heavy. That's heavy.
There's power to this.
You just shook me right there.
Yeah. When you think about this in the context of let's say as a planet, as a people in this world, we're on a journey. Where are we on that continuum? We may be closer to the moment of the most stunning revelation of clarity in history since we went into the cloud of obscurity in the garden, if you want to look at it that way. As you get closer, there's going to be a cultural white noise. And the significance of signal-to-noise ratio is going to be more significant. It seems to me we're destined to be in a world of clutter and distraction as we get closer and closer to that moment of absolutely shocking, stunning clarity of truth. And so there'll be all kinds of things that will try to pull us away from that signal-to-noise ratio. And I think that makes the signal strength more important, that we speak with clarity and truth, that we don't mince words, but we do it artfully.
I think that honesty, in fact, brutal honesty, I think is a real hallmark of this generation. And I like it. I did a book signing. I was telling Pastor, I did a book signing in Dallas a couple years ago. And a guy, about 25 years old guy, came up to the table. And I said, well, tell me your name. I'll write it in the book. He said, oh, no, don't put my name in it. Because if I don't like the book, I can't sell it on eBay. Oh, thanks a lot, buddy. And but that brutal honesty is really characteristic. We have a saying in Hollywood that Hollywood is famous for making fake things look real, and Christians are famous for making real things look fake. And wow, what an indictment. What an incredible indictment. And it's so, so true. And I think one of the things that we need to think about is how do we come to terms with reality and honesty and face this culture in that kind of, in a credible way. I just think that's really, really important to get the attention of this generation.
And just on that, it is brought to mind in a couple years ago when I first picked up a copy of Unique, Phil's book, and just probably there were not too much that were written about social media and how to use it, certainly not a church ministry context. And I remember you clarifying just on there how, as organization or church, to be okay with honesty, feedback, and not to delete the comment. They're going to say something negative about your organization. Well, let's just delete that comment, just to leave that on and allow the dialogue to happen. And that really is one of the marks of how this next generation likes to be heard. They like the dialogue. They don't want to be censored. They don't want to feel like they don't have a voice. And certainly social media has allowed that. What would you say has changed in the area of marketing or trying to tell story, and whether it's comic or in film? What has changed recently or looking forward in terms of continuing to be effective in being unique or coming out of the clutter? What would you say we need to do as business owners as we share our message to the next generation? What do we need to be aware of? What has changed in the way they receive messages?
I don't think we've realized the impact of how media has become a two-way conversation. Storytelling on every level has become a two-way conversation. When I showed you that picture last night of our first TV set, it was exactly right. 3 channels, and it was a one-way conversation. Today, this generation's grown up with iPhones and Androids and interactive TV. It's a two-way conversation. You guys pick the next American Idol. Well, in the U.S., you pick the next American Idol by texting on your cell phone. Our office in Santa Monica used to be across the street from J.J. Abrams, who produced the TV show Lost. Remember that show Lost? It was just a mega hit years ago. And I was in the parking lot one day talking to one of his producers, and I said, why do you think the show is so huge? And he said, well, there's a lot of reasons probably, but one of the biggest ones we think, he said, we discovered there are hundreds of dedicated fan sites to the show. And he said, so every week our producers and our writers sit together and we look through those sites and we rewrite storylines based on what the people are saying. And I thought, whoa, what if pastors did that? What if writers did that? What if television producers generally did that? What if business leaders did that? What if we actually listen to what people are saying? Doesn't mean we tone down our theology or change our storyline just to make it weaker, but I think this generation has grown up wanting to be a part of the conversation. And if we don't include them in that conversation, we will lose them. There's no question about it, because they don't understand what one-way communication is about. They've grown up in a two-way world, and that's the way we have to be.
And I think in light of all the clutter, what that allows me to do as a fan of something is it allows me to attach myself to a bigger story and have some significance.
Yeah, that's good.
We talk about two-way and Comic-Con. When you're at Comic-Con, do the fans come up and tell you what they want to see, and does that affect with the direction of the story and how it goes?
It depends on the story. In a lot of cases, if I've already finished the story, they'll come up and they'll tell me, how they would have ended it, But, I don't have to go to Comic-Con for that because because a lot of times just you can read reviews online and, people are so mean online.
Tell me about it.
Oh my gosh.
And Christians can be mean online.
Oh, Christians are the worst.
I wrote a blog post last year about why I thought Christians should go see the movie Noah. And I said, look, this is not the biblical story, but I said thousands and thousands and thousands of people are going to see this movie. And I said, if you've got somebody you've been sharing the gospel with, or you feel awkward, talking to them about God, take them to see the movie, then go out for coffee later and tell them the real story. I said, it's a great platform. And oh man, I got ripped. I got more than 1,600 comments to that one blog post. And I was called the spawn of Satan. People questioned my salvation. One guy, at least he was creative, one guy said, I hope you enjoy your 30 pieces of silver. I went, whoa. Awesome. So, yeah. And what's interesting, too, is, for you Bible scholars in the crowd, the guys that are nastiest, first of all, the critics online never use their name. They never use their name. And the worst Christian critics always put Berean in the name somehow, because they were the guys, that studied the scriptures diligently in the New Testament. And so it's always Berean guy 77 or Joe Berean, and because they think they're such scholars, and they just rip you to shreds. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, my favorite is when they go, what? You want me to be honest, don't you? And then I say, you know what? If you can't be honest and loving at the same time, no.
But this is a reflection of the times as well, isn't it? It's the mass depersonalization of, so that in the Zeitgeist there's this exchange of ideas, but you don't have to own it and show up in person and be incarnational in that way. So there's a part of it that's actually robbing us of our fullness of our humanity. We're fragmented again in this way. And I think part of what our task really is to introduce people to an ideal. And what is that ideal? It's something that transcends us, that we're still trying to grasp, that we're part of, but trying to get a hold of so it can get a hold of us. And you look at this generation, absent any kind of compass or moral plumb line or way of seeing truth or being introduced to it, everything is relativistic. We're even taught that it's relativistic. So you go back to a Nietzschean, power elite. Might makes right. Whoever has the loudest voice, the most impressions. It's a fatal way to look at life. Well, most people, we took a poll. Everybody thinks this. Well, everybody can and frequently is wrong. So trending and following everything. Well, this is what everybody thinks right now. Well, what's the point of a democracy of dunces?
When I finally got to do a future Captain America story. It was part of Earth X and Universe X and blah, blah, blah. It was this big Marvel project I did. I ultimately had Captain America killed by a mob. Because I felt like, if he worshiped democracy, if his God was everyone having a voice, and those all voices became the same thing, or the same voice, or the same choice, ultimately that's the fate of having the wrong God. Because the wrong gods will always destroy us, even if that's a good thing like family values or democracy or anything like that.
Thanks for killing Captain America, by the way.
But he came back as a warrior angel.
Well,
this is
okay,
the
that's
comic
different.
world,
Oh, that's good. That works.
Let me touch on the hows. I want to certainly. Phil mentioned it just earlier in his session about the use of video in the communication and short videos. And certainly when Jim was sharing about telling our story in 20 minutes, I'm thinking, well, how do I tell it in 2 minutes, in a video to have a compelling story on that? When you coach or consult, whether it's a 30-second ad or 60-second ads, what are some of the components? Like, what are you trying to, what are the main things that you get your either clients or the people that you're trying to tell that story to? What are some of the things that we can take away to say the next 2-minute video that you're putting together to have that message go viral? What should they
I would
include?
say whether it's video or not, even in a live pitch meeting, if you're going in with an idea to talk to someone, and Gordon's probably pitched 1 million of these, and Jim has too, but the idea of keeping it short is so important. I'll have people that come to me and they, Phil, I want to tell you my idea. And I said, okay, well, let me hear it. Well, what happened was, in high school, I didn't really like my classes that much. And, of course, my mom went through a divorce. And then, I had an aunt. She had a gambling problem. But, okay, I went out for the football team. Shut up. I'm already bored. I'm done. So, you know what? I have a life I want to live. So, first of all, make it short and sweet. If you can't pitch, we have the term elevator pitch in Hollywood, which is if you get in the elevator with a studio executive and you're going up a few floors and you have the opportunity to pitch your movie, can you tell him your idea in that short little ride? And I think it's good with a testimony. I think it's good with anything you're talking about. And so I constantly tell people, get to the point, fast. I don't have a whole life to listen to you drone on. So whatever you're trying to share with someone, I think it's important that you keep it within a few minutes, if you possibly keep it within a few minutes. Now, if they want you to go on, great. But always be ready. I think, having a story inside of you to share with a non-believing friend or the project you have, I think you should always be ready to do that with anybody. It's incredibly important.
And in a lot of cases, like even on the testimony thing, I talked about how you tell your whole life story, in 20 minutes. It can just be like, I've got that gun story. There's a prison story. There's this. Sometimes a testimony, especially when you have just a short amount of time, is just one story that has some sort of poignancy or something at the end that made you ask a question that's worth asking. In a lot of cases, I'd say if it's a 2-minute video thing or something like that, just make it good. And that means it better end well. Because you may be like, oh, anyone will sit around for 2 minutes. But you know what? Don't be like, they got everything that's of any worth in the first 20 seconds, and then it goes on for 2 minutes. Make sure it starts great and it ends better.
Well, then there's the power of imagination and the power of the moral imagination. How do you distinguish those? You can do things that are creative and different, but sometimes they are plumb line. They're a way of secretly disclosing the concerns of our own souls. Frankly, even the Catholic canine piece we saw was really creative in that it made you think about what if. Honestly, I thought it was real at first. And I thought that's just really fascinating. But there are ways of making us think. And look, C.S. Lewis said this is so important, going back to the things that brought wonder and innocence to our first curiosities and acquaintance with literature, and going back to those things and igniting those things. There's too much video out there. Frankly, there isn't a need for you to do another video, to be perfectly frank. But to study it and do it with discipline and focus and listen to people who can guide you, coach you, help you, mentor you in creating something that's really engaging. There is room for and look, we all see the things that go viral. Why? Because a lot of thought and preparation and consideration of detail, or it's just a random moment that just hits the funny bone of a larger audience. Still, in all, we have a platform. What are we going to do with that platform?
I'm going to have Veronica kind of run around. If you have a question, you can put your hand up and she'll get to you. Just as she's trying to find someone that has a question for any of these gentlemen on the panel here, I'm going to jump to one of the things that Phil touched on about a design-driven generation. I think one of the topics you talked about, that we are a very design-driven generation. I want to kind of maybe ask you to expand that, maybe even specific to whether it's in film. We saw the trailer for the Hillsong movie that's coming out, and your experience in working with churches, and maybe you can speak on design within that context, reaching the church group or the unchurched within that context. What are some of the things we can go away back to our churches or our organization to suggest, to implement?
Well, I tell most churches, don't let your brother-in-law design your logo. Oh, sure, he's got Photoshop on his laptop. Don't. Take it seriously. You know, design matters. Design really does matter. It tells a story. And Gordon and I were talking that, by the way, your logo is not your brand. Your logo is the visual expression of your brand. You come up with what that story is that surrounds you and what you do, and the logo should express that. So just because you come up with this hip, cool logo, that doesn't mean you're branded at all. And there's a lot of things like that I think we just need to take very, very seriously about it. I mean, an earlier generation of Christians created the Sistine Chapel. They did some of the greatest art the world has ever known. We were the leaders. We set the pace. And now I went into a Christian bookstore the other day, and I saw a Jesus Hates It When You Smoke ashtray, and I saw a cross USB drive, because Jesus saves. Get it? And can we do better than that, please? Hello? So, yeah, we just got to raise the bar when it comes to using design to reach a generation. Because, I mean, I was in Russia. I was teaching media professionals in Russia, and I got a chance to really study the icons, Russian icons, you know, and they're pictures of biblical scenes essentially on a piece of wood. And for generations, illiterate peasants in Russia, that was the gospel to them. They would pass these around, and they would tell the Bible story based on these pictures because they couldn't read. And so the earliest Christians around, they were visually driven. So I think we're actually going back. This is not anything new. We're actually going back to something that was very vital in the history of Christianity. So I think it's powerful. Veronica, you had anybody out there?
And design in and of itself, it probably should be said at some point, is not virtuous. There's the good, the true, and the beautiful. But design, I mean, look at the post-Bauhaus movements of the Germans where Hugo Boss designed the uniforms for the SS. And Dr. Ferdinand Porsche designed the first, the people's car, the Volkswagen. And I mean, great design, but basically it was harnessed as slave labor for promoting the Reich. There are great designs today that will betray our biblical illiteracy and lead us. What a beautiful aesthetic that leads us into captivity. We must be wary. Design in and of itself is not virtuous.
Well, that punctured my bubble. Thank you very much.
Well, and if you go back to
You're right.
The classic Christian fish, that was code. That was a code to be able to know if you could talk about Christ with someone or not.
I'll tell you something interesting about that. Do you know that the first generation of believers, the early church, never used the cross as a symbol of who they were until the last person who had actually witnessed a Roman execution had died? The idea that you would use a Roman execution tool as a symbol of our Savior, as a symbol of who we are as a people, that was anathema. They would never consider that until enough time had gone by. Now, today we use it, the empty cross as a symbol of resurrection and freedom. But it's just interesting to note that something that we hold so dear today, the cross, the early church never would have considered using it. It would be like if Jesus was alive today and executed 2,000 years from now, we'd be wearing electric chair jewelry. Oh, that is such a precious necklace you have. That electric chair necklace is gorgeous.
It could light up at Christmas.
I love that electric chair bracelet. Yeah. Every church should have an electric chair up on the wall inside of it. Images have meaning. They have power, and we need to think about that. And I even tell pastors, never just put a cross in your church without explaining it to people. People walk in the door today have no clue what that means. They don't get it. I tell you this, and I'll shut up. We have this jewelry mart in downtown LA. It's about a 4 square block area where just amazing jewelry shops, and you can go down and get some great buys. And because I'm an awesome husband, I snuck down there a few years ago to get a Christmas present for my wife. So I'm down there, and I'm at this kiosk, and this guy's showing this young couple. I'd say they were about 30 years old. He's showing them a tray of cross necklaces. And I have the spiritual gift of overhearing what other people are saying. So I was listening. And the guy brought out this tray of necklaces. And it was really interesting because at one end of the tray, they were real ornate, fancy schmancy. Sorry. They were real simple on one end, and they got more fancy on the other end until the very end was a Catholic-style cross with Jesus on it. And they were all just really beautiful necklaces. So I'm overhearing this 30-year-old girl in L.A. look at this tray of necklaces. And she's saying, wow, these are beautiful. I really love these necklaces. These are gorgeous. And then she got to the end and said, whoa, hang on a second. Who's the little guy on the necklace? Why is there a little guy on the cross necklace? I don't get it. 30-year-old woman in Los Angeles had no clue who the little guy on the cross necklace was. That's who we're speaking to. When you share your story with this generation, don't make the same assumptions that you have. You're talking to that woman in LA.
That's good. That's why I talk about being pushed. You know, each time we have these guys come and do a conference, we're making a checklist of things like, oh, I hope we don't have that on our thing. I hope we don't have that. So, but we want to hear some questions. So if Veronica has, maybe before you ask a question, just introduce your name. And if you're with an organization, your company, just to give us some context, that'd be great.
My name's Richard. I'm from Australia, and I worked in the 3D industry, worked on Lego movies. And my question was for Phil and Jim. And I was wondering, as Christians in the media sort of creation entertainment field, how do you balance, you know, our sort of morality as Christians in that field with making stories that are, you know, still real versus stories, you know, that are sanitized sort of Christian stories that, you know, a lot of people, you know, can't relate to. How, you know, where have you drawn the line, and where, you know, where have instances where you have to say, no, you know, I can't do that because it, you know, comes against my beliefs?
The first time I said, no, I wouldn't do a project, I regret because of how much money I would have made doing it.
But compromise is okay,
but,
you know.
well, I think about that now because it was the comic book adaptions of Left Behind. You know, I was just like, you know, if I do, I don't necessarily agree with everything that's going on in these, and I kind of hate how these books have become as big as they are. I just don't think I want my name attached to this project.
That's interesting. My favorite review of the first Left Behind movie was, the only thing that really got left behind was the budget. That was kind of a great review.
Well, you know what? I was just upset in the remake recently that we didn't get any good, great Nicolas Cage screams out of it. Because that's why I watch a Nicolas Cage movie. But in answer to your question, you know, I never write for Christians. I just write for people. But I write also thinking that if Christians are going to read this, this will resonate with their faith and they will appreciate what I'm writing about. And, you know, this is something like, something that if they're a comic fan and they read this book, they could share it with another comic fan who's not a believer, and they could be like, you know, this whole idea is what I always tell you about Jesus. And there's an important thing about symbols in the C.S. Lewis book, and I'm sure I mentioned this last time because it was one of my favorite things, Letters to Children. A woman writes to C.S. Lewis and says, I'm really worried because my son loves Aslan more than Jesus. And C.S. Lewis said, well, the fact that he's even saying that may make him a saint, and so I'm very sorry for you because there's nothing harder on mothers than giving birth to a saint. But then he goes on to talk about Aslan, and he says, you know, we worship a giant god who probably understands that a talking lion in a mythical world is more exciting than a crucified man on a cross. And he said, but the things that your son loves about Aslan right now will be the things he could come to love about Jesus later. And so even in looking at Iron Man tonight, as we will, you know, we can, you know, the things we love about certain elements of Iron Man may be the things that we can share with people, just like, you know, Phil was talking about, you know, yeah, go with someone to see the Noah movie, which, by the way, I kind of like the Noah movie. There were a lot of storylines involved, and they all kind of seemed to be the classic Old Testament storylines. You know, there was so much interesting stuff going on in that movie. But not because, like, I wasn't hurt that it wasn't, you know, the classic Noah story, because, you know, Charlton Heston would have had to have been in it. So,
Don't we have to judge things on several levels here? And this is where I feel a sort of cautionary note that I want to submit to both of you. And that is that we don't always know the motive of people. When the Noah film was done, it wasn't biblically perfect. It wasn't conscripted to everything we know, and there are a lot of things we don't know. Let's be realistic about the biblical revelation that need to be supplied by the imagination to make certain elements of the story work. But having said that, I think there's also in my own soul a need to give room to people who don't always comport to my aesthetic. So we can talk about, you know, Byzantine icons, and we can talk about the Sistine Chapel, see the high and elevated art that was funded, and sometimes by corrupt regimes in the name of Christendom. But at the same time, we look at the faithfulness and obedience of Howard Finster. Now that may not, that you thought that was had iconographic value for your wall. You found out later it's very valuable in another way. But isn't it true that what's valuable in God's sight is the motive and the fruit of it? And I think there's a danger that because we're privileged in many cases to be around people who have more developed aesthetics and budgets and ideas, and there's a danger that we can sort of laugh and guffaw at people whose ideas are simpler, but their motives may be purer than our own. And I believe we have to accommodate the fact that we don't know people's hearts.
Too, with your question, I just think we all have to make our own choice where that boundary lies, what projects we'll do and what we don't. And as Gordon said, and we need to give each other a lot of grace in that. Instead of being so snarky and nitpicky about, well, I wouldn't have done that project. One of my close friends in LA is Dean Batali. He wrote and produced that 70s show and really got his career launched doing Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And he's got a lot of criticism because he's a Christian guy. Why would you do Buffy the Vampire Slayer? And his response is, do you know where that show would have gone had I not been in that writer's room? He said, me being in that writer's room changed the direction of the program. It would have been much, much darker than that. And so there are Christians, I just think God places Christians in different people, and for us to get snarky and critical of what they're doing, I just think is a huge mistake. Let me say this about Noah, by the way. It's interesting. I was on the set, met everybody, you know, Darren and everybody on the crew, and I had an interesting conversation with a set designer. Secular Jewish guy, terrific guy, done a number of films, but not even remotely a believer in any way. And he said, you Christian guys, he said, I don't get it. He said, you know what, when we got this assignment, we decided to really research the ark. And he said, you Christian guys, throughout history, you portray this sanded down, nicely done little boat with pointy ends. He said, they didn't have that technology back then. They said, you have a rudder. Exactly, where was Noah going exactly? You know, where was he going to go? And he said, so I got my crew together, and I said, look, this is not about a boat trip. This is about the end of the world. Build it fast. And he said, we went back to the biblical references, and this is the most accurate rendering you'll ever see of what the ark probably looked like at the time. And I thought it took a secular, non-believing Jewish guy to take us back to what the ark really was like. And the other thing I'll tell you is this. The other crew, 4 or 5 crew guys came up to me and said, and these are not believers at all, and they said, I don't know what the deal is. We made a lot of movies in our career, but there's something special going on here. He said, since we built this ark and have started filming, every day somebody's family wants to come and have their picture made in front of it. He said, hardcore grips and gaffers and guys that are just really hard-living guys, they break down weeping in front of this thing. And they'll have their dad and their mom, and they'll bring them to the set and make pictures. And he said, I don't know what's going on, but there's something here. And just little things. God does amazing things that we have no conception of, and we have no idea what's going on. So it's interesting. Sorry.
So we kind of protest too much.
Yeah.
Is I think the message.
Yeah, it's good. Next, another question?
Hello, my name is Hugh Forster. I'm interested a little more, Jim, in your testimonial talk, and I've heard a number of outlines of how to do testimonial, but to my memory, yours is the first that really focused on fear, because you encouraged us to start our story with an image of fear, as I recall how you described it, and then the difference that God had made in our lives and how we can face now the fear that we started our story with. Can you expand a bit more on why? Is it to show our vulnerability that we too have fears, or why is fear the premise of the testimony?
Well, because fear reveals what we fear in life is what reveals our true God. What we're afraid of reveals our true God. You know, it's interesting. Every time an angel shows up in the Bible, their first words are, do not be afraid. Like they're showing up to faithful people, you know, who would be the first to expect the possibility of an angel existing and showing up, and yet every time an angel shows up, it's do not be afraid. And if this is going to be a great book for someone else to write, the fact that there are 365 examples of the verse "do not be afraid" in the Bible means that someone could write a daily devotional just about being "do not be afraid." And because fear reveals our the God we really worship. When the God of the universe gets involved in our lives, he is never going to allow us to keep on worshiping false gods. Gods that will destroy us, because that's that whole idea. If whatever false god you worship, that god will ultimately destroy you, even if it seems like a pretty good thing. And God wants to save us from that kind of destruction.
Now, there were about 9 things he just said that could be Twittered. I'm just going to tell you that right now. That was good stuff. Somebody out there ought to be on their phone.
That's good. I think we have time for one more question here.
Yeah, hi guys. My name is Sean, and I just had a question. I was thinking about everything you guys have said about the importance of telling story, and I just wonder if there's a line between telling our story and having an art to it and God's power intervening in the testimony, right? Like, at some point, do my words really matter? Like, is it me convincing somebody else, or is it the power of God using my words, whatever those poor examples are, to reach somebody else's heart?
I'm ready for this, if you guys are ready. Remember that verse I shared, the Revelations 12:11, where it was the blood of the Lamb and the power of our testimony? It's both. It really is both. I mean, that just shows how God is so self-assured in his godness that he would even include us in the process. So yeah, you write, but even if you're writing a story, you're writing about things that touch you, and then recognizing that God will use us in ways that you never even imagined he could use it. It's part of the process. You know, like, oh, my wife reminded me before that I need to put a plug in for my stories or for the books I have downstairs. So here's an example. Like, you know, when I get to do Superman, I have to be somewhat careful because they're just not going to let me do what I want to do. When I do Captain America, it's not the same. But with my own projects, I can do that. Like, I have a book called The High Cost of Happily Ever After, where I wanted to show the true princess story. I wanted to show the story where she gets married at the beginning and then everything goes wrong after that. And it's really, I wanted to do an allegory for how the church, sometimes the church in captivity, is attacked by the devil while the church is hoping for her prince to come and rescue her. You know, one of the other books, Foot Soldiers, is about these 3 teenagers who go to the graveyard where the superheroes are buried, and they try to rob the graves. That's how they get their power. They put on the original shoes of the greatest heroes who ever walked the earth. And then the rest of the story was showing how impossible it is to fit the role of an icon. How that's not how heroism works. That heroism isn't something that you get from, you know, that heroism is something that you put on, but it really doesn't fit. And all the cowardliness and all the fear and stuff like that goes about this. I think people don't like to talk about fear in their testimonies because we've kind of just gotten away from seeing fear as a helpful and good thing, in the way that fear is something that is living inside of every human being. And your testimony, if you're going to talk about what makes you afraid, your way of speaking to someone else, and this goes back to Scott Derrickson too, is by getting in contact with what makes them afraid too, and then showing how God can make it possible for you to laugh in the face of fear. How you can sing on the way to the lion's den, you know, and all that kind of thing.
Good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I want to end just giving each of you a last word to share on that. And I think that's part of the objective. I think that's a great question that was being asked, is that we want to continue to learn to improve our craft in terms of telling our story, and that being the God story, whatever God has called you to do, to discover that one big thing that God has given you and how to do it well, and recognizing that ultimately it is God's story, that there is an upper story, and that if it's just about us, it is just my story, what James wants to do, I know there's not much to it. I could make it as interesting. I can have all the fixings around it, and it wouldn't be any good if it doesn't point to ultimately the one that drives it. So how would you kind of summarize in terms of the balance of that then? Why is it, again, same question almost, why is it important that we're here and continue to come and learn to tell the story better? Any of you want to just jump in with one final point?
I'll just start briefly. I think there's a dominant narrative in every one of our lives, and it obscures or fights against or is conflicted often with who we really are in that one great thing. You were told at one point in life, perhaps, you'll never amount to anything. You can't do this. Your secret fear, your secret defect, whatever it is that you're overcome. Some people overcome it triumphantly, but it's always looming in the background. What we need more than anything, and what story will help us get to, is no matter where you've been or where you are now, there's a better ending, and we're on our way to that ending. And understanding story discloses how much more alike we are in that journey than different. And I think it gives us strength and courage.
And yeah, that's so good, Gordon. I'll follow that up by saying, you know what? Your story is the only way you will be able to do what you can to convince someone else that God is real, to show them that God is real.
Say that one more time. Sorry, Jim.
No, I said your story is the only thing you have to convince or show people that God is real. So that's why, again, you need to practice it and make sure that you can tell it as well as you can.
Probably the thing I'd leave with you is it's interesting to look at the life of Jesus. He had 3 years of adult ministry on the earth before he was executed. He was God. He knew what was coming. He probably should have written a book about theology or maybe doctrine or church leadership. He should have been smarter than he was. But what did he do? He told stories. He was willing to risk one shot, 3 years of adult ministry to the power of stories. And what's interesting to me is he didn't even explain them all the time. Sometimes, his disciples were kind of dense, and sometimes he would go back and explain to them quietly, just to them. But most of the time, he would drop stories on people and walk away. Just think about that for a minute. He was willing to risk. He had 3 years to do this, to change the world, and he was willing to risk it on the power of telling a story. And yet, very few times do we really are we willing to risk that. We just don't. We're nervous about it. We feel like we have to explain everything. I'm telling you, the power of story is far more influential, far more world-changing than we could possibly imagine.
And getting back to your question, that's so good, because then, plus we know that there's the Holy Spirit out there who's then going to make the connection later. We just have to do our part of it, and do that part of it really well, but it's not just about us.
That which you've heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, impart to faithful ones who will be able to tell others also.
That was great. And with those words, 2 Timothy 2, you are dismissed to go tell others. Be back here. Yes, let's give our panel a big hand. So good to have you here.